Love an idea.
Okay, we're recording. We are up and running.
Good.
Okay, you ready?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll take it away. Am I sharing?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so today
And a
we're
great
talking.
shot too.
Pardon me?
Oh,
A great shot.
Thank you.
fabulous.
Today I'm going to talk about panoramas. So, what is a panorama? It comes from the Greek word meaning all sight, namely everything you can see in front of you from left to right, not to infinity. That's a panorama. And in the old days, people could use film cameras to capture panoramas in one of two ways. The cheap way with compact film cameras was they actually would screen off part of the top and bottom of your frame and then give you something that was shaped in a panorama. The better way was fancier cameras that actually used more of the film, a longer section of the film, and with the appropriate lens to give you a panorama. But today we have digital cameras, and the way we do it is you take multiple pictures and you overlap those pictures and then you merge them in software, creating a panorama like you see on the screen. So why would you want to shoot a panorama? Well, first of all, it can give you a wider view than what you can get with any lens. Note though that panoramas can be both vertical as well as horizontal. The vertical ones they sometimes call vertiramas. Okay. The second thing you can get with panoramas is you can produce images with more pixels, so you can get more detail for larger prints. And if you really want to take it to an extreme level, you can shoot images and overlap them both horizontally and vertically, creating what are called multi-row panoramas, thereby creating images with billions of pixels, and then you can print them on a big wall. So I know certainly if I see something that I want to take a picture of and I think, this has got the potential for something I might eventually want to print big and put on the wall, I will shoot a panorama of it. Because if I turn my camera to the portrait orientation rather than landscape, I'm going from, say, 4,000 pixels to 6,000 pixels in the vertical. And if I overlap a bunch of shots horizontally, then I can get, a lot more pixels in my image and create a large picture from it. There's one other reason you might use shoot panoramas, and this deals with star photography. Now, normally what we're told when you're first learning about star photography is it's a good idea if you want to take landscapes with, say, the Milky Way up above, get a nice wide angle lens. And that'll be great because with a wide angle lens, the stars are particularly small in your image. And as the Earth is rotating, you can't see those stars moving, causing star trails in your image for a long time. So with a 14mm lens on a full frame camera, you can take a shot for maybe up to 30 seconds and not notice that the stars are starting to trail and spread out. And that's great. But what astronomers have known for a long time is if you've got a longer lens, then the aperture for that lens is, of course, physically bigger, and a physically bigger aperture lets in more light. And so if you, instead of taking a wide angle picture with a wide angle lens, say a 14mm lens, if you instead use something like a 50mm lens and create a multi-row panorama to produce the same field of view that you would have gotten with your 14mm lens, even though a 50mm lens, you have to take shorter exposures to prevent the stars from trailing, you will have nevertheless let in more light, and your images will end up with a reduced amount of noise in them. And so people use panoramas in star photography for reducing noise.
Just one quick question, Jeff. How do you get around this? The stars are moving, and if you're the time delay between the first and last picture, you have software that.
It's basically, the software is pretty good at that. And so you'll start at one point in your panorama, take a picture, maybe move up a column, take a picture, move up a column, take a picture, and then move over horizontally, take a picture and go down the column. And of course, the stars will have moved by the time you finish taking all those pictures, but the software is pretty good at figuring out what images line up with other images, and it will do a good job of it. Purists, namely people who take astronomy seriously and know where every star really is, if the software has made mistakes, they'll probably be able to find them. But for us mere mortals, we'll never see it, and you'll get great looking photographs. So it's
always going to line up with
to the rescue.
It'll line up the horizon, no problem though. Just some of the stars maybe slightly out of.
It will not typically be an issue.
Just curious. So.
Often with star photography, you take pictures of the landscape below it separate from the stars above it, and you blend these together. That's one way of dealing with it. But that image that I had at the opening, that was a panorama taken with 7 different pictures merged together with software. The landscape was lit with 2 lights, and so I didn't have to take separate pictures for the landscape and the stars, and the software blends it all together. And you don't have to worry about stars at the horizon. It just sort of all magically works.
Did you take that picture in the portrait mode?
I took that in portrait mode, yes.
So Jeff, explain to me again how using a longer lens, if it's the same f-stop that you're shooting at, lets in more light for the stars. Is it simply because they're bigger?
No.
I don't understand.
So here are the 2 competing factors. The amount of time that you can expose a star picture typically goes by the 500 rule. Typically goes by the 500 rule. So
right.
If you've got a 14 millimeter lens, you take 500 divided by 14, gives you 36. If you've got a 50 millimeter lens, you take 500 divided by 50, that gives you 10. Okay, so you've got 36 versus 10, and it's a linear relationship based on focal length. Okay,
right.
But let's say these are both f2.8 lenses. Okay, if you look at the aperture of the 14 millimeter lens, its aperture is going to be basically 14 millimeters divided by 2.8. So what, 4 millimeters? And the aperture for the 50 millimeter lens is going to be 50 divided by 2.8. So it's like 17. But the amount of light you gather goes by the square of the aperture. And so you'll take the, you'll get a much bigger area that grows up linearly with the focal length, whereas your focal, the time that you get to take the picture decreases left. The time decreases linearly, the area increases quadratically, and so you can just let in more light if you've got a longer lens.
Just accept the doctor's answer, Paul.
Yeah, well, I mean, it sounded so sophisticated. I can say nothing but, oh yeah, I understand.
It's from a math point of view, it's kind of the same principle as why do you get more energy efficiency if you use a variable speed pump on your pool compared to a constant speed one? Well, it's because slowing down the speed reduces the energy by a quadratic factor, whereas the time only decreases linearly, and so you
Okay.
end up better off.
So Jeff, your Milky Way shot, you shot that with what lens? A 50 or a 24?
I shot this with a 14mm lens,
And you shot it in vertical?
and it was vertical orientation. Yeah,
Yeah.
portrait orientation.
Okay, so you did not use a longer lens on that one.
Oh, no, no. I've never done that. If you want to do, first of all, I don't have the fast prime longer lenses other than a 100mm lens, and it's only a 2.8 lens. So if I had a 35 1.4 or a 50 1.4, those would be good lenses for doing this. I don't have those lenses, so I haven't tried it. Plus, there's extra equipment to make that an easy operation to do, which I'll discuss later, that I would have to worry about.
Okay.
Again, I've commented before, but I think that shot was fabulous.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So how do you shoot a panorama? Well, the easiest way is take out your phone, if it's a smartphone, use the photography app, move it from the normal picture to the panorama option that it has, hold it up, press the button at the bottom, and sweep it out left to right. It'll even give you a little arrow on the screen to help you keep it nice and steady and level. And press the button at the end, and the result is you get a nice panorama picture out of your phone. The software is capable enough that they can do this on smartphones and get wonderful results. I'm sure most of us have done this, and I think you'll probably agree the results are kind of magical. The downside, though, of this is you only get a single row panorama. So if you wanted to take a picture that wasn't just wide, but was also both tall and wide, you can't really do that with any phone that I know of. And the second issue is the result you get is a pre-cooked version that the phone comes up with that's a JPEG image. And you can certainly edit a JPEG image, but you don't have the same flexibility that you would have if it were a raw image. And so that's a limitation. So that gives you good motivation for wanting to use your DSLR or mirrorless digital camera to create panoramas. And so how do you use those cameras? With those digital cameras, what you do is you take multiple pictures and you overlap those pictures and then use software. So for example, at the bottom of the screen, we see 4 pictures of delicate arch. And if you look at them, you'll notice that from the first picture to the second, delicate arch moves from the right side of the image to the left side of the image. So those 2 images have overlapped by about 50%. And the same is true of the third and the fourth image. If you combine them with the appropriate software, it will create the image that you see at the bottom right, which is a wider panoramic view of delicate arch that has more pixels than you would have been able to get if you just had a single image taken with your camera. In addition, you might be able to shoot wider than you would otherwise be able to do. Note, you can do all this handheld. You don't need a tripod for it. But if you do shoot for a tripod, you can get somewhat better results. And I'll show what all that means coming up. Okay, so what are the recommendations to do when you're shooting a panorama? First of all, I do recommend using a tripod if at all possible. And what you need to do is you need to keep the tripod base and your camera level. So namely, you set up your tripod, and most tripods come with a bubble level on them. So you adjust the legs of the tripod to get that nice and level. And then you put your camera on the head and you make sure the camera itself is level, because depending on the head, you might have to level that. And then then you're set up, okay? For each of the pictures that you're going to take, you want to keep basically everything the same exposure, that is aperture, shutter speed, ISO for all the shots. You want to pick a focus point and then freeze that focus point. You can do that by looking at your entire composition, the whole range that you want to put into your panorama image, find the place that you need to focus on that first, and then switch your lens to manual focus. Or you could do the approach that I take, which is I put focusing on a button on the back of the camera so that I can focus once, and then when I take the individual pictures, my camera, the lens can be left in autofocus mode, but touching the shutter button will not refocus because that's only done with the button on the back of the camera. So that's the approach that I use. You keep the white balance the same for all shots. So don't leave it on auto because that can change as you move the image from left to right or right to left or up and down. So put it all in daylight, or if you shoot in RAW, that'll be fine. You can leave it in auto because you can later set the white balance to all your RAW images and assign that to them before you merge them together in the software. One thing you should avoid, even if you're taking pictures of a landscape, is don't use a polarizing filter when you're doing a panorama. And I'll show you an example of this later as to what happens if you do use a polarizer. Because polarizers filter different amounts depending on the orientation towards the sun, you'll end up with a sky that is light blue, transitions to dark blue, transitions to light blue through the course of your panorama, and it will just look really bad, and you'll have to spend a lot of effort in Photoshop trying to fix that if you do that. So you can avoid it if you just don't bother using the polarizer at all. Now, as I said, you need to overlap the images, and I generally recommend 50% overlap. That's what I do because it's a pretty easy figure to get. If you've got live view on the back of your camera, you can look at the picture, look at what's in the center of the live view. There's typically some focusing point or other indication of the center of the screen. See what that is, rotate your camera on the tripod until that point gets to the left edge and stop there and then take your next picture. So 50% overlap is a good rule of thumb to use. I'll point out though that wider focal length or shorter focal length lenses, so like a 14mm lens, a 24mm lens, those need more overlap than telephoto lenses do. And what I've found is sort of sticking to 50% is good because it kind of works for everything. But if you're using a telephoto lens, you can get by with less overlap if you want. Now, one guy that I've followed, and you'll see a picture of him later in the presentation, he actually recommends 67% overlap. And what that means is that every part of each image will appear on 3 of the pictures that you take because of you're having that much overlap. And he likes that because that allows for a mistake. You'd be surprised at in the frenetic operations of taking these pictures. You'll take a picture, rotate your tripod, lock things down, take a picture, rotate your tripod, move it, lock it down, and sometimes between locking it down and rotating the tripod, you forget to take the picture. So mistakes can happen. And so more overlap gives you the ability to overcome some of those mistakes. You can shoot whichever direction you want, left to right, right to left. It doesn't matter. The software will figure it out. In fact, you don't even have to hand the pictures to the software in any particular order. The software these days is able to figure this stuff out. One thing you might do if you have the option to put a grid up on the live view on the back of your camera is do that. With my camera, I can put a 6x4 grid, so it allows me to easily figure out where that halfway point is on the image so that I can overlap 50%.
Jeff, are you going to comment about a leveling base?
Yes, I am
using
going to comment
IAS?
about all the wonderful hardware you can spend your money on.
Okay.
Okay.
Jeff, you
Yes.
made, I obviously understood your polarized filter problem. What about a graduated, like a soft grad, 3-stop, if you got a bright sun,
If you have a level horizon,
right?
yeah, you could put, a graduated neutral density filter on there. That would work, because if you've leveled your camera and your tripod, then your horizon is going to be level across your image as you rotate through.
Right.
Okay.
If you have, say, the sun's heavier influence one side or the other to the end result of the panorama, that soft grad might be needed to kind of enhance the opportunity to get more dynamic range when you get to the bright side. Will it make the opposite side very dark by comparison?
It would make the opposite side darker, yeah. So that's a trade-off you have to make. So
Okay.
in situations like that, you've got a couple choices. You could use the graduated neutral density filter, and maybe it's a better compromise to let it darken down the part of the panorama that you don't need to darken down, because it helps out so much on the brighter side.
Right.
The other option is you can combine taking panoramas with anything else that you do in single shots to blend images together. So HDR bracketing, you can combine that. You can combine it with focus stacking if you need to do that. The more that you do, of course, the more complicated things get.
Right.
And so you just have to sort of trade off what it is you're willing to do.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Jeff, is this some sort of special software you use, or is it something we already have?
I'll talk to you about, it's most likely something you already have. For example, if you already have Lightroom or Photoshop, you already have it, or
Okay.
Photoshop Elements.
Right.
There are specialty software packages that you can get for free and some pay for that do more than what Lightroom and Photoshop do. But typically all you need is Lightroom and Photoshop, or if you have Affinity Photo, it's got the capability. On1 Photo Raw has the capability. There's lots of software that'll do this.
Okay.
Jeff,
Yes.
to your second bullet point, use the same exposure for all shots.
Yep.
Maybe this tags on to Craig's question about the neutral density filter. I'm not sure I understand that when you have, let's say, relatively significant differences in exposures across the panorama. So, if you're in RAW, I understand you can make those corrections. So is that the point?
The point is you don't want your camera radically adjusting the exposure in between images, because that will make it harder for the software to blend those images together.
Okay.
Okay, so you want to have the same exposure throughout.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. When you create panoramas, and I'll show you detailed examples of this, the different focal lengths give you sort of a different look to the resulting panorama image that you get. Longer focal lengths produce images that have less distortion. And if you have a really wide focal length lens, it's going to produce a lot of distortion. Now, if it's of something like landscape, you may not notice it. If it's architecture, you'll definitely notice it. And so that's one thing to keep in mind in doing panoramas. The longer the focal length you can use, the less distortion you'll have in your image, but it may or may not be the image you want to make. Okay. As you do the shooting, what you should do is plan to shoot wider and taller than you think you need, because there will be some cropping involved at the end. And I'll show you exactly what that looks like. And then finally, as you're taking a sequence of pictures that are going to become your panorama, each individual picture is not necessarily going to have a very good composition. And if you're reviewing these pictures later in whatever software you review your pictures on, and it's, you know, months later, you might wonder, why did I take this picture? It just looks crummy. Well, what you can do is take a picture of your hand in front of the lens at the end of your panorama series. And some people actually do it at both the before they start and after, so that you can identify to yourself that, aha, these series of individually nondescript images together form something that's going to be good. But you know, don't delete them just because you can't see the promise in an individual image beforehand.
Some of us even do that in the middle of the sequence. Never mind.
Hey, Jeff,
Yes.
your second bullet there where it says, I'm sorry, the third one, use the same focus point for all shots.
Yes.
So if you're looking like, say, a delicate arch, you're putting your
Mhm.
focus point on delicate arch, then you're moving 50% over. Where's your focus point going to be on those subsequent shots?
What I'm saying is focus once and take multiple pictures. Don't refocus as you're taking each of those overlapping pictures.
Okay.
The issue you can run into is for most people's cameras, when you press the shutter button, it will refocus first.
I see. I see.
And so what you should do is map out your composition, you know, decide from left to right, top to bottom, what you're going to be taking a picture of, decide where you need to focus. That will be used in conjunction with whatever aperture you choose. Okay, so you'll focus it and then switch on your lens to manual focus so that it doesn't refocus when you start taking those pictures. That's the recommendation.
Thank you.
You also said, didn't you, that you could use a back button focus technique?
Yeah, in fact, that's what I do.
Okay,
So if you use back button focus, then
you
things
don't
will
have to
be great.
switch to manual. Okay.
Okay. Now, before I leave this slide, let me draw your attention to this device on the right side in the picture. That is a what's called a panorama clamp. Okay, but it would be, you stick this on top of your tripod head, and then you attach your camera to it. There's typically, you put a plate on the camera and that snaps into this. And you'll notice this has a bubble level in it. So what you can do is, instead of fighting with the three legs of your tripod to try and get your tripod level, you use this bubble level to get this panorama base level, which is pretty easy, especially if you have a ball head. Just tilt it until that bubble level is centered. And then there is a knob on this panning base that you can loosen, and you can rotate around the center of your tripod just using this. So that's the easiest way to get yourself set up for taking panoramas, is because the leveling is all done with this one little device. The problem is that I find is that since it's just got a bubble level on it, it means that your horizon is going to be smack dab right in the middle of your image. And for some images, that's great. But I find for most of my images, I want my horizon either above the middle line or below the middle line. And you can't level it with this. This only levels for a horizon on the middle line.
Ah,
Okay. So notice I have one. So I got that before I figured that out. But I'll just give you that warning beforehand in case you guys get tempted that there are some limitations to that. But there are plenty of other complicating issues to go further on, and we'll talk about other hardware. Okay, so now that you've taken the images, what do you do? Well, we've discussed this a little bit. You merge those shots in software. I'm going to be showing you how you do it in Lightroom, because that's the software I use. It works mostly pretty great. I've got a few examples of where it can sometimes fail, but mostly it works great. But even if you don't have Lightroom, if you have Photoshop or Photoshop Elements, you can do panorama stitching in those. If you have On1 or Affinity, those do panorama stitching. These are general purpose photography processing applications. There are at least a couple of special purpose ones just for panoramas. One called PT GUI, which I think you have to pay for. Another one called Hugin that is free. Those are, sir, I would call the top ones sort of the top level, higher level panorama stitching. They give you a lot fewer options to play with to create your panorama, but they mostly work just great. And why complicate issues if you don't have to? These P2 GUI and Hugin, those are the lower level ones that give you all the options you could ever hope with in how the software figures out how two images overlap with each other and how they should overlap. And if you run into problems, you could correct them with those pieces of software, but they're very complicated to use. So I'm not going to be discussing them. I just want to make sure you're aware that such software exists. And if you ever need it, those are two ones you might turn to. Okay, so how does panoramic merging look in Lightroom? So you go into Lightroom and you browse your images, and you can do this in either the library module or the develop module. It'll work in either. And you select the images that you want to merge together as a panorama. And so you'll see in the lower left-hand image, part of the image, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 images selected. I right-click on one of those images, come up to, in the pop-out menu, to photo merge and select panorama, or I could have gone up to the photo menu option at the top and pulled down this same set of choices, and you choose panorama. There's a shortcut for it, Control M on PCs. I think it might be Control M on Macs as well. So you issue that, and then Lightroom will bring you up a preview of what the panorama is going to look like. And here is what the preview looks like. So a whole new window pops up. That window is resizable. So if it starts out too small for you, you can just drag it and make it bigger. And this window gives you the handful of options that Lightroom allows you to use to create a panorama. So if we look at this panorama, there's a couple of things that I'll point out. One, you can easily identify that I didn't quite get my tripod and camera quite level because there's this little gap that's rising to the right. And similarly, it starts big from the left and shrinks. So I'm just a little bit off of level in taking that. Nevertheless, the software was able to blend it all together. That didn't matter. It just hurts me in that in order to get a nice picture, I'm going to have to crop off based on the worst amount on the right and the worst amount on the left. So I've lost a little bit of the top and the bottom. Okay. The second thing I'll point out is you can notice that each of these, here are each of the individual separate images that it overlaps. And there's this little staircase that you can see on the top and staircase you can see at the bottom. Those are all nice and rectangular looking. What that tells you is this was shot with a telephoto lens. And in fact, it was a 400mm lens. When you use non-telephoto lenses, these individual images that it overlaps are no longer rectangles. You get a nice scalloped edge to everything, which means there will be more cropping to do. Okay, so that's the first thing we observed by looking at the preview of the panorama. The second thing is here are the options off to the right. You've got 3 different projections that you can choose from: spherical, cylindrical, perspective. You can deal with these gaps in the edges in 2 different ways. One is called boundary warp, the other is filled edges. I'll explain these. And then you can have Photoshop, Lightroom, if you want, automatically crop off the missing pieces by selecting the auto crop option. You can choose auto settings, which is it will adjust the tonality, the exposure, the shadows, the highlights, the white point, the black point automatically for you if you'd like. Okay, and then finally, you can have it take all 8 of these images, and in Lightroom, you can create a stack where you see just one image representing all 8 of them, and it's got a number that says there's 8 images underneath me. Okay, so those are just options you can have. What do these various options mean? Okay, the first thing you choose from is projection. So think to your days in school where in the classroom you had a globe and maybe on the wall there was a big map of the world. What the map of the world is a two-dimensional projection of the three-dimensional globe that you have. And what you'll typically see on that map of the world is that the poles of the globe, the North Pole and areas of Canada and Greenland, and on the south end of the pole, Antarctica, get stretched way across the top of the two-dimensional map because there's no other way to take a three-dimensional thing and spread it out onto something two-dimensional. Well, the same thing is going on when you're taking a panorama with your digital pictures. Logically, you've got individual two-dimensional pictures, but they're representing a three-dimensional world. And how should the software blend those together? That's the projection. And spherical is the one that I use the most. I find it works usually the best. Cylindrical is another option you have. What I find is cylindrical just tends to make your image look taller. So if you compare a spherical projection to a cylindrical projection, the cylindrical one will look like, I just kind of stretched it a little bit taller. Okay, but the one thing a cylindrical projection will do is it will try to keep vertical lines nice and vertical. And it can do that because a cylinder is, goes straight up and down and lines in the vertical direction are straight. Whereas on a sphere, lines have to eventually bend and join together at the poles. And so straight lines can bend a little bit. Okay, the final projection is one called perspective. And this is a strange one, and I'll show you some examples of it. It tries to keep straight lines straight, but it also tries and takes your image and projects it onto a flat piece of paper. And as a result, the left and right edges of your image have to be stretched out wider than the center of your image. Makes for some interesting things, but if a perspective projection actually works on your image, and it won't work for really wide panoramas, but if it works for your image, I find that using it in conjunction with the boundary warp option can create some compelling looking final images. Okay, we'll see some examples of this, but spherical is the one that I typically tend to use.
Jeff,
Yes. Go ahead.
would you use cylindrical for architecture?
It might be a better choice for architecture. What I tend to do, and what you should do in doing panoramas, is you have the option during this preview to click on each of these various projections. So click on them and look at them and pick the one that you think looks best.
Got it.
Once you've chosen it, then at the end you click this merge and it goes through the process of creating the whole panorama. This preview is not a full-size preview. And in fact, if you click on it, it will zoom in to the maximum it will zoom in. But I think the maximum Lightroom allows is 2000 pixels across. So it's not your full image. Okay.
Jeff,
Yes.
in using portrait mode, would there be an advantage to using cylindrical?
No.
Okay.
You choose cylindrical versus spherical based on what looks best to you. And we'll look at some examples of these and you can give me your opinions later.
Okay, thanks.
I've sort of mentioned this, but the two options to deal with the holes on the edges, given the fact that there are going to be some, are boundary warp and fill edges. With boundary warp, Lightroom will just simply take the pixels that you have that are part of your image and stretch them out to cover those missing pieces that are white. So missing pieces here on the top and the bottom, it would just stretch the image this way and stretch the image that way to fill them in. Sometimes that looks great. Sometimes that doesn't look great. The other option is fill edges. And what that does is it uses the content-aware technology that Lightroom and Photoshop have to create pixels to fill it in. If it's something like a sky, content-aware fill will fill that in really well, and you probably wouldn't be able to tell. You can't tell it from this preview, but there are actually houses down here. And if we bring up the shadows, you could see some of these houses down here. Content-aware fill wouldn't work very well in that area. It would look kind of funky. So I wouldn't use it for that case. But in some cases, the content-aware fill, fill edges might work well. And of course, then the third option for dealing with these holes is just crop the image. All right. So when you do this processing, with a panorama, what do you do to your images before you actually do the processing? I said you could invoke the panorama option from either the library module or the develop module. So the develop module kind of indicates, well, maybe I should do my processing beforehand, like play around with the exposure, play around with the sharpening, clone out the dust spots, do whatever you want to do. As it turns out, Lightroom only allows certain things, certain amounts of processing to pass through before a panorama is created. And so any sort of local edits like cleaning off dust spots or dodging and burning, it would just throw them away. So don't bother doing them. Global options such as adjusting the exposure, playing with the shadows and highlights, those will pass through. But when Lightroom merges your panorama together, it creates a DNG file, which is a raw image. So you have the same processing capability at the end after you've created a panorama as you did before you with the individual raw images. So there's really no need to do the processing beforehand. Okay. What Lightroom will do to your images, though, is it will look in the metadata and it will try to determine from the metadata what camera and lens was used, because it has profiles for lots of different lenses. It will then try and do corrections based on its lens profile that will fix the distortion that the lens caused and will fix the vignetting, namely the darkening of the corners that is just a characteristic of all lenses. It will try to fix that because that helps it create a more uniform merged panorama image. I read some advice saying that, if your particular lens has bad vignetting and Lightroom's profile doesn't correct it completely, you could try manually adjusting the vignetting. But I've done some experiments with at least my 14mm lens, and I found that playing with the profiles and the adjustments in the lens corrections sometimes just made things go really bad for Lightroom. So my general recommendation is don't do any processing of your images before you create a panorama of them. As far as normal Lightroom raw processing goes, just let Lightroom deal with the image. The exceptions to this is if you're doing something special, like your focus stacking images, you'll need to do those yourself. Lightroom will not do them for you. So you'll need to export images to be focus stacked, probably as TIFF files, do the focus stacking on those, and then you can do the panorama once you've created all those different focus stacked images. Since you're exporting TIFFs, you should do all your tonal adjustments then before you export them. All right. So,
Well, Jeff, if
yeah.
You automatically do lens profile correction and chromatic.
It's probably
or-
okay because I do that. Okay. And so with, I've got various different lenses, my standard Canon lenses, the information is written into the metadata. And so I do have an import profile which says, use the profile for the lens that you see. And when I do that, everything works fine. Now I've got a couple of other manual lenses that don't communicate any information to the camera. And I use these lenses for star photography. And those lenses, one's a 14 millimeter, the other's a 24. I tried, and I'll demonstrate this at the end today if we have time. I tried doing some merges where what I did is I went in and I looked and saw, Lightroom did not find the information on this lens in the metadata, so it didn't do a profile correction. Nevertheless, the panorama it created was just fine. I said, maybe I can do better if I put the profile in. So I went and I found the profile and just entered it manually from a pull down list in Lightroom. And then I went and tried to create the panorama and it failed miserably. So depending on the lens, and I think wider lenses like a 14 millimeter lens, those are the ones that you can run into the most trouble with. Something standard like a 24 to 105 or a 100 to 400 zoom, anything like that, I think will work well. So feel free to use your import presets to tell Lightroom about the lens profile and it will be fine. If you don't tell it, it's going to go look for it anyway. So I don't think there'll be any issue. Okay. So any other questions at this point? Now I want to show you some examples of what panoramas taken with different focal length lenses actually end up looking like. Here is one with a 14 millimeter lens. And let me point some stuff out to you. If you look at this image and you look at the far left-hand side of the image, you'll see a street. That's Avenida Sombra. If you look at the far right, that's also Avenida Sombra. So that's the same street and it's a straight street. It's not a curved street. So this image is very wide. It's a 180-degree panorama. And you will see also lines in my driveway. These are straight lines in my driveway, but in my panorama, they are no longer straight lines. The reason for that is we've got a very wide lens, which creates a very wide field of view, top to bottom, as well as side to side. And, there's no way that we can look at something that's that wide and keep those lines straight and put it onto a two-dimensional sheet, which is what our image is. So if you've got a wide angle lens, you're going to get distortion in the resulting panorama. If it's architecture, it looks really funny. If it's a landscape like the Milky Way panorama on the title page of this presentation, you don't even really notice the distortion there. So it depends on what you're taking a picture of as to whether that distortion is going to be an issue. Let me point out a couple other things about the panorama. First of all, on the sides, you can see that this edge is not vertical. What that means is I was pointing my camera slightly down. And when you point your camera down, you're going to get sort of pie-shaped pieces of image for each of the individual pictures that you take. And here's the round part of the pie, which as you overlap different images forms a sort of scalloped edge to your panorama. That's that scalloped edge and these missing pieces of the corner. That's why you're going to have to crop something off or use boundary warp or fill edges to get a normal, full rectangular image out of this panorama. Okay, so let's go on to the next example. Oh, before I go on to the next example, you can't really see it here in this picture, but if you zoom in and you look really closely, there are stitching errors in this panorama, namely lines that are supposed to be straight and continuous have breaks in them. And you know, I've mostly taken pictures of landscapes, so I've never noticed anything like this before. But I zoomed in and I noticed it in this particular image because here it is, architecture. And the problem, though, we have with Lightroom is there are very few parameters to play around with. There's no parameter I can adjust in Lightroom to fix this. I mean, I could try a cylindrical projection. I could try a perspective projection if it works and see if that fixes it. But in general, it didn't. And so if this is an image that I really want to use, I'm going to have to go into Photoshop or some other tool and do some cloning to try to fix these stitching errors. And there are probably stitching errors in here too, but because the stucco, you know, doesn't have anything that we can really, you know, view easily, we don't happen to notice them there, but they're probably all over this image. Okay, so I wanted to point that out. Now, there is the custom or the fancier software, Hugin and PT GUI, they would give you tools for going in and fixing these stitching errors by adjusting how the software is blending the images together, and you could fix those. There was another piece of software that Microsoft put out called ICE. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's a panorama merging software. I would have mentioned it earlier, but they no longer have the download for it, so you can't get it anymore. It had some parameters I could play with, and I was able to adjust some of those parameters and fix all these stitching errors in that software. But in Lightroom, sorry, you can't do it. Okay, so if you get them, you're going to be doing some cloning in Photoshop. Okay, here's another example, and this is a handheld example I took while out scouting for doing night photography. And as you can see, I was out with Paul and his evil twin. And I used my 24mm lens to take this picture. It's a manual focus lens that I thought was set at a decent focus point. It wasn't, so we got an out of focus panorama. But that doesn't matter. The software was able to handle it. It handled both the fact that it was handheld. It handled the fact that I couldn't keep level while I did the panorama. You can see it's sloping to the right. You'll also notice because the edges bow out to the top, that meant I was angling the camera up as I was taking the picture. The idea being to get a Milky Way panorama along the top. Okay. Nevertheless, it took the picture. And aside from the fact that, you know, if you've got moving objects like Paul, where you might get repeats as an object moves through your image, the stitching looks fine. I don't see any obvious errors in it. I don't even see any obvious distortion because it's a landscape. Certainly there would be distortion there, but it's just not all that obvious. Okay, let's go on to another one. This is with a 35mm lens of another landscape. You can tell I was pointed down by the edges. I kept my tripod pretty level because it doesn't slope too much to the right. And the distortion doesn't look bad. So when we're getting up to a 35mm lens, distortion isn't really much of an issue anymore. And if we continue on to a 50mm lens, this one was barely angled down. This line at the edge is almost perfectly vertical. This image ends up looking as if, you know, I can't see any distortion at all in that. Okay, and so the point is, the longer your lens is, the less distortion the image will have. If I were doing architecture that were at a distance with this 50mm lens, I'll bet the resulting lines would be wonderful, nice and straight, wouldn't be a problem. Okay, if you go even farther, here's a 100mm lens. Once again, looks very nice. I didn't quite keep my camera level in this particular one, but that's okay. The stitching software worked out great. This is one case, however, where, I don't know if you've been paying attention, all the previous examples, I chose the spherical projection. For this one, I decided that cylindrical looked better. As I said, cylindrical tends to take your image and make it look a little taller. And I thought that made this mountain just look a little bit nicer because it was taller compared to the spherical projection. So for this case, I would choose cylindrical. Let's do a more detailed comparison of what these projections do. And here is an image that I shot on one of our outings to the Big Sur area. This is the northern part of Garrapatta Beach. And here is a spherical projection taken with a 35mm lens. You'll notice I'm angled down slightly. Tripod looks pretty level. Okay, there's spherical. Here's what cylindrical looks like. Okay, it got taller compared to the spherical. I'll go back. There's spherical. Here's cylindrical. The cylindrical gets taller. Which do you like better? That's for you to choose. Okay, it's purely a matter of your choice. What do I think represents the image that I'm trying to create better?
Which would be closer to the original, the image you see with your naked eye. That rock got a bit taller on the right.
Yeah, you know, what I would have to do is probably go back to the original images that comprise this panorama and look at those images and compare it to the panorama and decide what I think is best. When I created an image from this, my final resulting image, I used the spherical. That's what I thought I liked best. Okay, but you don't have to. Okay, but there's a third projection that you can choose, and that one's perspective. And this is what it looks like. So perspective is a really weird thing, okay? What it does is it tries to take your pixels and spread them out on a flat plane instead of something that curves like a cylinder or a sphere. As a result, it's sort of got to spread out the pixels on the left and spread out the pixels on the right. But if this works, and I'll point out, it only works for panoramas that aren't too wide. If you go way wide, Lightroom will just tell you I can't make a panorama at it. It'll give you an error message. If it works, this boundary warp option actually gives you some interesting looking stuff. And here's what this looks like if you use boundary warp. It warps it back into what looks like a pretty reasonable representation of the scene. There are a few things I don't like. Due to all that stretching, the texture over here looks a little bit chunky to me. I think it's kind of losing some of its sharpness over there. In addition, these poles that are on the highway up here, that we can see in the upper left, they're kind of angled off to the various different angles. And I'm not real keen with that. That looks weird to me. Now, in the final image that I created, I cloned those out, so, you know, it really wouldn't matter. But, you know, it's just causing some distortion here that I'm not so keen on. We could instead try this with a spherical projection and see what the boundary warp does to that. This is what that does. It got these poles straighter. I like the texture over here on the left better, but my ocean horizon is now curved. So you're going to have to look at these options like boundary warp or fill edges, and on a case-by-case basis with each image, decide, does it give you something that you like, or do you want to just use cropping instead to create your final resulting panorama?
Jeff, are you able to switch this to cylindrical for a moment?
I can't right now because I'm doing a PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, no problem.
But later I'll try to run Lightroom and we can do whatever you want.
I was just curious because it seemed to me as you were showing these before that in cylindrical, the waves came up a bit higher, but that's just my recollection. So
here's cylindrical, but without the boundary warp. Okay. I don't know if the waves look higher.
No, probably the same.
Probably the same. Okay. Yeah. All right. But as I go back and forth between these, you can see various parts of the image zooming in and zooming out or distorting. So
Mhm.
you're going to get different images depending on which projection you choose. And it's up to you what you like best. You're the artist. Okay, so what I've just shown you, taking your pictures, overlapping them, leveling them, trying to do them on a tripod, using Photoshop, or not Photoshop, but Lightroom to choose a projection. That gives you really all the information you need to create some wonderful panoramas. You really don't have to do anything fancier. I mean, keep in mind, your phone can do a panorama without anything other than, software. So I'm going to now go on and talk about some fancier stuff that you can do, but it's not clear that it's actually going to get you a better panorama other than making certain aspects of doing this work easier, particularly if you want to do multi-row panoramas, okay? But everything that I've shown you up to this point, that's going to be what you need for the vast majority of your panoramas, truly.
Jeff, before you move on, can I ask one question? You were on the hill looking down at the ocean.
Yes.
And your distortion on the sides was indicated that your lens is pointing down, obviously.
Yep.
So did you build in, knowing that you're pointing down, extra width than what you thought you would need for both sides? So that you crop it, you have the data?
I probably didn't think about this with the 35mm lens. I knew that I wanted to get, certain things in the image, like I probably wanted to get to this point, okay, to have this whole rock in there. And so I'll shoot a little bit wider than I need. But if you're not tilting it too far, it isn't going to bend it in a whole lot. And we do have boundary warp type things or fill edges to fix problems if they occur. But in general, you do want to build in some extra room, and it's just to deal with the distortion that the software has to do on your images to make it all fit together.
Do you have a recommendation for how much? Another 50% or 30% or?
Yeah, at least another 50%. Maybe, I mean, to be sure, an extra image on each side. And if you're overlapping the images 50%, that would be essentially a 50% extra. So yeah, an extra image on either side would be great. And if you're using a really wide lens, like a 14mm lens, then maybe even more. If we get to a demonstration in Lightroom, I can show you how big a difference it makes for that when you're really tilting one of those.
All right, thank you.
You bet. Okay, so now let's go on to the fancier stuff. Okay, do this experiment. Close your left eye, hold up a finger and align it with something vertical like the edge of your monitor. Once you've got that done, now open your left eye and close your right eye. What happens to your finger? It's shifted right relative to the edge of your monitor. That is something that's known as parallax. If you're looking at objects from different angles, like our two different eyes, objects near and far are going to have a different orientation relative to each other. And, that can cause a problem for software that stitches together panoramas. Why? Okay, let's take a look. Here is an image from somewhere in downtown Portland where the photographer has taken a picture of this light stand with a pink gaffer tape on the top of it, and there's some buildings in the background. The left of the two tall buildings you can see, and in front of that is this white building that the gaffer tape, the pink tape, is just to the right of. Now let's say I want to make a panorama, and so I rotate my camera and lens to the right, moving the light stand to the left side of my image. And then we look in the background. Where does that line up compared to the building, the white building? Whereas in the left, it was to the right of the white building. And on the right image, it's to the left of the white building. So if I'm panorama software and I'm trying to stitch this together, and I've got to try and figure out, where does this light stand go? Does it go to the right of that white building or to the left of the right building? And it might decide, it might take all of the light stand from one image and everything looks okay, or it might do like Lightroom did with my garage picture and take part from one image and part from another and sort of shift them. And you might get a Lightroom that breaks right about here, and you've got part of it to the right and part of it to the left. And that's going to be a real problem for your image. So those kinds of errors, parallax errors, are going to cause issues in your panorama software. Now, strictly speaking, it's only going to cause an image if you've got objects that are close to your camera and objects that are far away. If you're taking a panorama of a far distant scene where everything is far away, it won't matter one bit. Parallax will shrink as you get farther away from the camera. Okay, but objects that are close will be an issue. However, if you have close objects, getting everything in focus might be an issue, and you might have to focus stack, and then you've got a lot more stuff going on. So in my panoramas, I tend to take panoramas that don't have objects that are too close because I don't want to focus stack and try to do panorama merging at the same time. Okay, so for me, this parallax stuff hasn't really caused a problem in my panoramas, but I nevertheless know how to fix it, and I apply all this stuff as I'm taking my pictures, but I think I'm probably really just wasting my time. And this is the stuff I do, and I'll tell you how you go about fixing it. It turns out for every lens you have, there is a point somewhere along the axis of the lens where if you rotate your lens around that point, there will be no parallax errors in the images produced. Okay, that's just an optical property of lenses. Now, if you've got a zoom lens, that point may be a different point for every different focal length. Okay, but for any individual fixed focal length, there will be a point. So if you can find that point and allow your camera to rotate around that point instead of rotating around the sensor, the back part of your camera, then you can avoid all those parallax errors. And you do that with a piece of hardware called a nodal slide, which you can see pictured here on the right side of the screen. The nodal slide allows you to take your camera mounted at the back in this clamp and move it forward and back so that you can line up the center of rotation, which would be right around here in the center of this tripod. You can line up that center of rotation underneath the point where there's no parallax error, sometimes called a nodal point, other times called no parallax point. And that's what this nodal slide allows you to do. But as I said, the nodal point is going to be different for every focal length on a zoom lens. So you're going to have to figure out what the nodal point is and create a list that write down notes to keep track of that. And that's what I've done on my nodal slide. So I've taken every lens that I have and I've made notes of where I have to adjust this nodal slide to where the numbers on the side of it line up with the 0 mark in the clamp. And what you'll see, like on this lens, a 24 to 105 millimeter lens, there are different values ranging from 5 to 13 as to where I have to slide the nodal slide to line it up correctly to not get any parallax error. What I've gone and done for the lens is figured this out for all of the focal lengths that are marked on the lens barrel. So 24, 35, 50, 70, 105. And I've figured those out. But what if I want to take a picture that's a 60 millimeter focal length? Say that's what gives me my best composition. Well, between 50 is at 7, 70 millimeters is at 9. So 60 must be at halfway in between at 8. And so that's how I do it. I do a linear interpolation between the various different points, and that's how I do it. Is that perfect? No, it's not perfect, but like I said, this is probably overkill anyway, so it's going to work well. Okay. Am I fooling you? Does that really work? Well, here's an example of where this previous photographer has taken this image where he's lined up his camera at the nodal point, and you can see that the pink lines up at the edge of the white building. When he rotates it over, it still lines up at the edge of the white building. Finding that no parallax point really does, fix the issue with the lens, and will allow the software to be able to stitch these with no errors. Okay, so a nodal slide is one thing you'll need if you want to fix parallax errors. What other equipment is going to make your panorama pictures a lot easier to take? One thing you need to do is get things level. And so this object pictured at the right of the slide is what's called a leveling base for your tripod. You put that onto the top of the tripod, and then you don't have to worry about getting each of the 3 legs of the tripod the exact correct distance to make your tripod level. What you can just do is loosen this down here. It's got 4 little knobs to hang onto. You twist it to the right. This ball at the top will tilt plus or minus 15 degrees. You make sure it's level with the level that's built into it, the bubble level that's built into it. Then you tighten it up. Now you've got a nice solid base, a level base, on top of which you could put your tripod head and create level panorama images. Another piece of hardware that I've only discovered recently is something called an indexing rotator, and that's shown at the bottom here. And what this thing will do is it's got a series of holes that you can screw this piece into. And this piece has a ball bearing that is spring-loaded on it. And in each of these holes, there are detents around the circumference of this cylindrical hardware that appear every number of degrees that the hole indicates. So in this case, there are every 30 degrees around. So there are 12 little detents around there that the ball bearing will snap into as you rotate this around. And what that gives you is a nice audible click that you can tell, aha, I've reached 30 degrees, which is the amount that I want to use to overlap my images by 50%. And so you can easily create these this overlap without any worries. Well, if you're taking normal pictures during the day, you've got typically live view in the back of your camera. You can easily see where something in the center of your image is that you need to rotate to the edge. This indexing rotator is probably way overkill. You don't need it. But if you're doing night photography and you want to do a Milky Way panorama at night, my camera at least, whatever shows up on the back of the camera is basically a black image, which if you look very carefully, you might be able to see some of the brightest stars if you zoom way in. But you don't have enough information to tell how much you're really overlapping. There's no point in the middle that you can rotate to the edge. However, if you use this device, you can just loosen it, rotate it until it clicks, tighten it, take a picture, loosen it, rotate till it clicks, tighten it, take a picture. You don't have to look, you just figure all that stuff out. So you just decide, depending on what lens you're using, whether you use the 30 degrees or 45 degrees or 20 degrees, whatever amount of overlap you want, makes life easy. Okay, So there's a couple pieces of hardware that make things easy. Okay, another piece of hardware that has sort of been implicitly built into this, but I realized I'd not really mentioned it when Ernie asked me a question during this past week, and that's something called an L bracket. Typically, what I use for my camera is I put a plate onto my camera and a clamp onto the tripod head, and the plate fits easily into the clamp with either a lever that snaps it into it or a screw that will, a knob that will screw easily to hold that in place. And that's a quick release for your tripod. A lot of them have it, but standard quick release plates only go on the bottom of the camera. So if you want to take these vertical images, like you're probably going to do for a panorama, you're going to have to tilt your camera over to the edge. And when you do it, your camera is going to be rotating it around here instead of rotating it around underneath the axis of your lens. Is that a problem for the majority of panoramas? No, I think the stitching software will do a wonderful job. It won't create a problem. You'll get a good panorama, even if you have to tilt it over. But you'll get a stabler platform if you can put onto your camera a plate that instead of just having the part that goes into the clamp on the bottom, it also has it on the side. So this is an L-shaped plate. That means you can rotate your camera, stick it on the top, and now all the rotation goes around the center of your tripod rather than off to the side. That gives you a stabler image, and it means that also your composition doesn't change from when you had your camera horizontally on the tripod to when it was vertically. Okay. This is something most people might not have, so you just need to be aware of that if you're going to go out and start shooting panoramas. And there's one thing I'll point out, because this is perplexing me for the future if I ever get a new camera. New cameras tend to have the LCD that comes out and you can angle it at whatever angle you want. Well, if you've got all this hardware here off to the left, this is going to bang into it. And that's an issue. So what they do is they tend to cut a hole in the plate to allow you to get it in there so that you could look down on it at least. But you have to contort this tilt swivel screen a lot to get it into there. And so that's sort of an issue. So it's not something I've had to deal with yet, but for those of you with tilt swivel screens, it's something to think about before getting an L bracket. Okay, so we've got all this hardware. How does it all fit together? Here's what my setup looks like. Here's my tripod. On top of the tripod, this is the leveling base. And I've set things up so that it can easily snap together without screwing pieces together. So my leveling base has a clamp at the top with a lever, and I have a indexing rotator that can fit into that clamp. So I can just clamp it in there. And then on top of the indexing rotator is another clamp, which fits into a bracket that's on the bottom of my tripod head. And so that just screws into there. And then here's the tripod head. On top of that is the clamp that holds onto either my camera or the nodal slide. And here's the nodal slide fitting into the clamp, and the camera goes on top of all that. So this is all the stuff that that I use to do the Milky Way panorama, and that I'll use whenever I want to use this indexing rotator. If I don't want to use the indexing rotator, the ball head just comes down here on top of the leveling base, and it makes for a less unstable and less tall bit of hardware and easier to carry hardware. But there is a slight problem with all this. Has anyone noticed what the slight problem is?
It's big and heavy.
That's one problem, but that's not the big problem.
Stability.
Pardon me?
Stability.
No, actually, I mean, it turned out stable enough. I mean,
Is it stable enough? Okay, for long exposures?
yeah, I think so, because I did take, reasonably long exposures. So I think it was okay. I mean, it would probably be nice if it were lower. And there are leveling bases that you can get a little bit lower and stuff, but that's not the big issue. The issue has to do with parallax. So I've got this nodal slide, and what I do is I figure out where along this nodal slide it is that I have to clamp that into here to get the nodal point over the rotating part of the tripod. So on this lens, this is a 14 millimeter lens, and that place that it comes for that lens is at 5.7. So the nodal point of this lens is like right about here. If I slid this nodal slide to where the 5.7 were in the clamp at the 0 point, that nodal point would now come back to here. I'm rotating around the center of this rotating indexer, which is the center of this tripod head, which is over here, but the nodal point is over there. I just went and messed up my nodal point because the reason is because I've tilted this camera back. If this camera were level, completely level horizontally, and I took the nodal slide, slid it back, then the place where I clamp it in at the 0 point and the nodal point on the lens would be all lined up over this rotating point, and everything would be working as planned, and there would be no parallax. In fact, here's some geometry to show you what's going on. The big vertical red line is where I rotate. This is where the nodal point is, but normally I'd want to slide this nodal slide back to here to the 0 point in my clamp. Well, that's just wrong because I've tilted this thing up so much. So what do I have to do? If I'm going to tilt this, I have to move this nodal slide from where I thought it was supposed to be for the horizontal to where it actually turns out for the tilted. And this is an issue that I knew existed, but when I started preparing for this presentation, that's when I actually made some pictures and did the geometry and figured out that, oh, that's really a big issue, a much bigger issue than I thought it was. So what I have to do now to fix this is I have to take this nodal slide, I have to eyeball where the nodal point on the camera, on the lens is, and move that to where I think it is over this center of the tripod. And that's all done just by eyeballing it now. So it's probably not perfectly accurate. And it just means that all this extra work that I've gone to use this nodal slide has up to this point kind of been a waste because I didn't do this correction until now. So there you go. That's why I said at the halfway point in this presentation that you really probably know all you need to do for a good panorama because the software really corrects a lot of these errors. And it's been correcting my errors all this time. But now that I know about it, I'm going to do this. Okay.
My question for your Milky Way shot, why would you even worry about it? Why even use worry about the nodal point?
Yeah, why would I? Because I have the hardware.
Cassius, Jeff.
And with the Milky Way shot, there was some stuff that was 20 feet away, 15, 20 feet away. Maybe, I don't know, maybe that's close enough that I should worry about the nodal point. In reality, no, it's not really an issue. One of the books I have about night photography, the guy in there writes that he doesn't run into any issues if objects are at least 100 feet away. He thinks maybe it might start to be an issue if they're closer than 100 feet. I think it's probably going to be issue if it's like closer than 5 feet. The bottom line is, I would say, if you don't need to focus stack, you probably don't need to worry about nodal points. So that's going to be my recommendation. I think that's closer to what the reality is.
That's a really good thing because I flunked geometry.
Okay. Okay. But if you care about that, or if you want to do multi-row panoramas, then you might want to worry about it. And here is the hardware you'd use to fix that. Instead of rotating around just, the tripod at the bottom, what you need to do is get 2 rotators. So you can build up a panorama tripod head out of a bar like this, like my nodal slide, a second bar that attaches to it at 90 degrees. And then you put, a rotating clamp at the bottom here. You put another rotating clamp on the horizontal side. You put your nodal slide in this vertical rotating clamp so that you can get the rotation around the nodal point of the lens lined up here. You adjust this so that you get the rotation lined up here. And then you'll be able to have the nodal point lined up, whether you do vertical or you tilt the camera up and down, or whether you rotate from left to right. So you can make all the panoramas you want in both one row or multi-rows or vertoramas. It'll all work. Okay. So that's not something I've delved into. I just haven't felt the compelling need to do multi-row panoramas. And if I ever get to the point where I think that I want to do that, I suspect that dealing with this hardware is just going to be more than what I want to do. And I'll just, go the full Monty and go to a motorized system. They make these where you can program in your panorama and say, I want to go from this angle to that angle and up and down and do it all, adjust for the nodal point, and just let the software handle it. So
Jeff,
if I'm going to do
really,
it, this is my solution.
You have really clarified something for me. If I'm shooting panoramas, don't have any close-up objects.
Yeah, if you don't need to focus stack, you're probably going to be okay. And keep objects a little bit farther away so that you can deal with just a single one focus point that'll cover from near to far. Life will be good.
Thank you again.
So let me finish out the presentation part of this with what do you do with your panoramas? Ideally, I'd like to be able to print them. Unfortunately, it's got a built-in hardware or software limit, really, where it won't let me print very panoramic prints. I can print up to maybe 25 inches long, and the prints can be 13 inches wide, so I can maybe get a 2-to-1 panorama, but that's the best I can do with my printer.
Told you, Jeff, I got one that goes up to 12 feet now. So.
Well, there you go.
You have some winners.
The issue you have with yours is, and even if I got your printer and I printed one up to 12 feet long, I'm gonna, how am I gonna display this? If I want to make a frame, well, you've got no problem. You've got old barnwood that you can make frames. You can make your own frames and they're cheap. But if you look online, panorama shaped frames tend to be reasonably expensive. And if you want to mat your image, the mats are going to be really expensive. So I think probably a better choice of things to do with panoramas is either to move to canvas prints or metal prints. And you can make those cheaper by breaking them up into pieces, such as a triptych like this. And so this is a panorama image that we have in our house in our dining room. And it's not even my picture, it's my wife's picture. This is why I try to take panoramas, because she's the one who has a picture up in our house rather than me. I'm trying to get an image that I can put in the house. And so but we were able to take one of her images, convert it into a panorama, blow it up in Photoshop, expand the number of pixels, and add a painterly type filter to it so that it looked okay, even if you stick your nose up to it. And through sending these canvas prints off to Photoshop, got a nice picture to put on the wall. In fact, the hardest part of doing this print is trying to line up the prints on the wall so that they're even. As you can see, I haven't quite perfectly managed it. It's kind of a hard job. But that's
So you moved it out of your other room, Jeff. So you got something new up there yet?
well, I'm still looking for that wonderful panorama image that the two of us can agree will go up on that other wall.
Yeah,
And I
people
haven't
probably
found-
don't realize, Jeff, you may want to mention that's Kathy did it with an iPhone. It's a pretty big picture, if I recall.
It is. These are, I think, 32 by 24, each of these panels.
Uh-huh.
Wow.
And it's an iPhone photo.
It's an iPhone photo, but like I said, I invented more pixels in Photoshop, and I used a make it look like a painting, a filter, so that it doesn't look pixelated at all. Okay. Okay, so maybe we have room that I can answer a few of these questions by going into Lightroom and showing you, what happens on various images. So let's do a panorama. So what you do, as I said, you select the images like that. So here's several images that I select. I can right click, say photo merge, give panorama. Lightroom's going to come up with this preview window. And now you can see how long it takes to do the preview. It's not that bad. And here is the image. Okay, this is from Bryce Canyon. Note, this is a spherical projection. What does a cylindrical projection look like? It's taller. To me, the spherical looks closer to the individual images that made up this picture. What does a perspective projection look like? Well, this is a pretty wide panorama. Even though it claimed it worked, to project the perspective projection kind of failed. And you'll kind of see that kind of stuff with Lightroom. Sometimes those things fail. One word of advice, if you're going through and creating this and you say, okay, this didn't work, don't just click cancel, click on something that works and then click cancel, because the next time you try to do a panorama, it will use the last projection that you chose. And if you've got a nice wide projection for which a perspective wouldn't work, it'll say can't create a panorama, and you'll panic and think that all is lost, where all you really need to do is click on spherical or something and you can create your panorama. Okay, let's see what other images I can find to look at. Okay, somewhere in here is, well, here's an interesting one to sort of look at. This is a vertorama. Okay, so you can do panoramas vertically if you want. That's spherical. This is cylindrical. Makes it look a little fatter. Here's perspective. Perspective worked. When perspective works, boundary warp sometimes produces a really nice looking image. Okay, here's spherical. Boundary warp looks okay for that. What does cylindrical look like? So it's your choice what image you use based on what looks best to you, what projection you use. We'll cancel that. Here's something for the Washingtonians. This has a pretty wide one. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 images that go and make this up. I think I shot this handheld. And what do the different projections do? Cylindrical makes it look taller. Perspective makes it look like that. When perspective works, boundary warp tends to look pretty good. So I don't know, choose which one you think looks best. Maybe the people who live in Seattle could tell me. Okay.
Yeah, you definitely got the Seattle gray skies.
Yeah, didn't I? Okay, so Art, you asked about this one and what happens with cylindrical. Let's do this one live. Okay, so there's spherical projection. Here's cylindrical. Do the waves look taller? I don't know. Here's boundary warp. That's nice and slanted with boundary warp. Same thing for spherical. Perspective, on the other hand, keeps that straight. Works. Let's go to something extreme. Here are some pictures. I went out scouting for Milky Way shots. Took some pictures, these pictures, don't need my hand. And let's see what Photoshop does with this. I had the camera tilted up pretty high. And I had this note, I forgot to remove perspective. It says unable to merge the photos. This is where you start to panic and you think, uh-oh, I can't create a panorama. Well, switch to spherical and life will be improved. Okay, so a couple of things we can observe. Because I was tilted up so much, and this is a 14 millimeter lens, the edges are really funky. Funky enough that part of the edge from over here got over here somehow. I don't know how that happens. Okay. Nevertheless, Lightroom seems to be able to deal with it. If you want to use boundary warp, it still works. Okay. So you can do these kinds of things. You can even switch to a cylindrical projection. Cylindrical didn't seem to work too well, though, for this. So not every projection is going to work when you've got a really wide lens, a 14 millimeter lens, and you angle it up high. Okay. So when we go to shoot in a couple of days, I'm going to try not to angle my lens up as high as I did on this scouting mission. For this particular set of images, I went and took each of these images now is unprocessed. So let's cancel that. So if I take a look at develop module and I look at, here's the lens corrections. If I enable profile corrections, I had to manually put in what lens this is, okay? And then I have to, go and do this for each of the other ones in here. So let me do that. Okay, so now I've enabled the lens projection for all of those. Let's redo the panorama. And something interesting happens.
Huh.
Okay, well, that was a first for me. I had never seen Lightroom do this before. The solution for me was to get rid of my lens profile for this set of images, and then it's able to handle them just fine. So just another tidbit of information I can pass along, that if you ever get something funky like this, see if you can get rid of the lens profile, and maybe it will work in that case. Don't know what the explanation for this is. And, boundary warp isn't going to fix it. It's really looks like a fisheye lens at this point. So, okay. What questions can I answer?
Jeff, have you tried merging HDR using Lightroom?
Yeah, so
I have had very
limited
sporadic
success.
success.
Yeah, that I've found the same thing. In fact, one of the sets of images I could have demonstrated for you, but it takes a while. I tried that and it just, Lightroom did not work well for it. So maybe in fact, we should take a look at
I
that.
don't know what I've been doing wrong, but I've had fairly decent success with HDR and panoramas.
I mean, you can see one of the options is HDR panorama.
Yeah.
In fact, I took a set of images and I went and I selected them and I said, create a panorama. And Lightroom came up with a dialogue that said, this looks like you've got HDR set of images in here. Would you like to do an HDR panorama? And I said, oh yeah, that's what I meant. And I did it. And then it, didn't do a very good job of it. I think it depends on maybe how wide your panorama is. It'll do a better job with panoramas that aren't as wide. But the nice thing is, if worse comes to worse, you can do the HDR merging on each of the individual panels of your panorama first, and then merge those HDR images with the panorama option here. And then, you'll be okay. And so I've had to resort to that.
Yeah, it's sort of hit and miss for me.
That's what I find. Glenn has been luckier, but I find it hit and miss.
Just could be the way the pictures I'm doing too. I don't know. I haven't done it a lot, but
Well, maybe your
I've
pictures are
done
better
work
than
out well.
ours. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, let's